Okay, so Nietzsche.
This is about understanding why Nietzsche still matters. And what he did with that pen, let's just say, he challenged pretty much every assumption Western society held dear. Nietzsche's life, though short, was anything but ordinary. Born in 1844, he initially seemed destined for a life of faith.
Really? That's not exactly the image that comes to mind when you think Nietzsche.
I know, right?
Right.
It's almost ironic. He actually aimed to become a minister, even began studying theology.
Wow, what happened?
Well, after just one semester, he dramatically renounced his faith. It was a pretty radical move, one that foreshadowed his later critiques of religion, morality, basically all the systems of belief he saw as well,
Shaky.
to put it mildly. But this early grappling with faith, with meaning, it really laid the groundwork for his entire philosophical project. And it wasn't long before his intellectual prowess became impossible to ignore.
This is where the whole rock star academic thing comes
Oh
in.
yeah, by 25, Nietzsche had already snagged a full professorship at the University of Basel.
So what was Professor Nietzsche like in the classroom?
Let's just say he wasn't afraid to break the mold. Hated that stuffy, detached academic style. Instead, he brought in music, literature, wove it all into his philosophical arguments.
Now that's what I call an engaging lecture.
Some loved it, but others, not so much. He ruffled more than a few feathers in those hallowed halls of academia.
Shocking. But before we get too lost in 19th century academia, we've got to talk about the tragic turn his life takes.
Tragic is right. Throughout his life, Nietzsche battled a whole host of chronic illnesses, migraines that would knock him flat, digestive problems, his eyesight was going, it all just kept piling on. Nietzsche's in Turin, Italy, and he sees this carriage driver just brutally whipping a horse.
Awful.
The worst part, Nietzsche, despite everything he'd been through, he wasn't a bystander. He'd seen the horrors of war firsthand as a young man. And yet, in that moment, seeing that horse, he completely breaks down, rushes to the animal, throws his arms around it, trying to shield it from the blow. That's the thing about Nietzsche, right? For all his talk about power, about the will, there was this deep well of compassion within him.
Almost a contradiction.
Maybe. Or maybe it was just another side of this incredibly complex, deeply feeling human being. Sadly, that breakdown in Turin, it marked the beginning of the end. Series of strokes, mental deterioration. He spent the last 11 years of his life unable to speak, unable to write.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? This brilliant mind silenced just as he was grappling with some of life's biggest questions.
And that's what makes his work so poignant, so powerful. It's like he wrestled with these immense, often uncomfortable truths so that we wouldn't have to face them alone. He wasn't just out to shock people, though he did plenty of that. Nietzsche genuinely believed that the old ways of thinking, the old systems of belief, they weren't just outdated, they were dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Well, he argued that Europe in the late 19th century, it was going through this massive identity crisis. All these new ideas, cultures, flooding in from the colonies.
So it's that classic clash of values. What happens when the world suddenly gets a whole lot bigger and your truth isn't the only truth anymore?
Exactly. And Nietzsche believed that this clash, this realization that maybe there wasn't one capital T truth, it was going to lead to a widespread sense of, well, nihilism.
Okay, now there's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but we're not talking about teenage angst here, right? This isn't just a phase you grow out of.
Right. Nihilism, as Nietzsche understood it, it's the belief that nothing inherently matters, that there's no objective meaning or purpose in life, in morality, in anything.
So why bother getting out of bed in the morning, right? If it's all just a cosmic joke, why not just stay under the covers?
And that's the danger Nietzsche saw. He believed that this sense of nihilism, this vacuum of meaning, it would leave people vulnerable to, well, let's just say less than savory ideologies. He knew that when people feel lost, unmoored, they'll grasp at anything that promises certainty, even if it comes at a very high cost.
It's chilling how relevant that sounds today. What were some of those key Nietzschean ideas, the ones that still make people go, huh, never thought of it that way before?
Well, there's perspectivism, for starters.
Perspectivism.
Nietzsche is saying that our individual perspectives, shaped by our experiences, our values, our beliefs, they literally shape how we perceive reality. There's no neutral, objective viewpoint.
No wonder we can't agree on anything.
And if that doesn't blow your mind, consider this: master versus slave morality. It's about power dynamics, not literal chains and whips. Nietzsche was critiquing systems of morality where, well, resentment becomes the driving force.
Resentment.
Yeah, like imagine a system where the oppressed, instead of striving for their own greatness, they focus on pulling down those in power. It's about leveling the playing field through negativity, not through actual achievement.
Oof. I mean, I get it. Resentment can be powerful, but it's also exhausting.
And ultimately self-defeating. Nietzsche believed that this slave morality, as he called it, it actually disguised weakness as virtue.
Weakness disguised as virtue. Okay, I need an example.
Think about it, traits like humility, selflessness, compassion, they're often seen as inherently good, right? But Nietzsche argued that in a system of slave morality, those traits are valued because they serve to weaken the powerful, not because they're inherently virtuous.
So it's not that those traits are bad. It's that they can be used to, like, control people, make them feel guilty for wanting more.
Exactly. And that brings us to another one of Nietzsche's biggies, the will to power. The will to power, as Nietzsche saw it, it's not just about brute force. It's about the fundamental drive within all living things to grow, to overcome, to express their full potential. It's the force that pushes us to evolve, to become more than we are.
So it's less about conquering others and more about conquering yourself, pushing your own limit.
Exactly. It's about self-mastery, about becoming the best version of yourself, whatever that looks like for you.
You know, when I hear you talk about Nietzsche, about this will to power, it reminds me of Dostoevsky.
Ah, you see the connection. Brilliant minds think alike, or at least grapple with similar themes. Nietzsche was a huge fan of Dostoevsky, or at least we have reason to believe he was familiar with his work, and the thematic overlap is undeniable.
Both wrestling with those big existential questions, but in totally different ways. Dostoevsky, through his characters, these psychologically intense narratives.
And Nietzsche, more head-on, philosophical, but no less intense.
Like, think about Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. He's trying to create his own values in a world that seems devoid of God, devoid of meaning, and it leads him down a very, very dark path.
It's the ultimate test case for Nietzsche's ideas, isn't it? What happens when we try to transcend traditional morality? Can we create our own values without descending into chaos and violence?
And then there's that scene in Crime and Punishment, the horse beating. It's brutal, heartbreaking, and it just so happens to echo the event that triggered Nietzsche's own breakdown.
Chilling, isn't it? Almost like a premonition. And it brings us to another fascinating aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy, the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Okay, now those sound less like philosophical concepts and more like Greek gods or maybe a fancy brand of olive oil.
Well, they're both. In Greek mythology, Apollo represents reason, order, control. Dionysus, on the other hand, he's all about passion, chaos, ecstasy. And Nietzsche used these figures to represent two fundamental forces he believed were at play within the human experience.
So it's like the classic battle between head and heart, logic versus emotion.
In a way, yes. But Nietzsche believed that a truly fulfilling life requires a balance of both. We need the Apollonian to keep us grounded, to channel our passions. But we also need the Dionysian to truly feel alive, to experience the fullness of human existence. It's about finding that balance between structure and abandon.
So what does that look like in practice?
I think Nietzsche would say it starts with taking responsibility for our beliefs, our values, our actions. Because if we're not defining our own values, if we're not creating our own meaning, then someone or something else will gladly do it for us.
But, okay, so let's say we accept Nietzsche's challenge. We're ready to forge our own path, create our own meaning. Where do we even begin?
It's about engaging with the world, with all its complexities and contradictions, and finding what resonates with you. Books can be guides, but they shouldn't be shackles. Nietzsche would probably say, burn all the books. Or at least read them with a critical eye and then go write your own damn philosophy.
And maybe even more importantly, to feel deeply. Because for all his talk about power and the will, Nietzsche was also a deeply sensitive, even vulnerable soul. And maybe, just maybe, that's where we find our own unique meaning. Not in some grand narrative, not in some external system of belief, but in the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking experience of being alive.
Nietzsche wouldn't want us to just think about these ideas. He'd want us to live them.
So, to our listeners, the next time you encounter that photo of Nietzsche, you know, the one stern gaze, epic mustache, don't be intimidated.
He's not judging you.
He's challenging you.
Inviting you to join the conversation.
To think deeply, to live fully, and to never ever stop questioning.